This is Force for Hire,
a deep dive into private military contracting and how it's transforming the battlefield.
I'm Michelle Harvin.
I'm Desmond Ferris, and we're your hosts. Welcome to our first glimpse into the lives of real people in this industry.
Our first episode gave a lot of information. We talked to some experts, researchers, and academics.
Now we'll pass the mic to a person whose life has been impacted by private military contracting and hear what they have to say, and let them tell you their experiences. Our guest today was a former U.S. Army infantryman turned private military contractor. But let's start from the beginning. Here's Adam Gonzales.
I remember being a kid going to baseball games or football games, whatever the case may be, and hearing the national anthem play and just kind of processing the words and thinking about the words of the national anthem and seeing the flag wave off in the distance. At a young age, it really kind of instilled a lot of patriotism in me, and I thought, well, this is probably my future calling, if you will. So I ended up joining the Army. I spent a short time there with a arose detachment. Our mission was reconnaissance and surveillance type of unit, more focused on the surveillance aspect. That was a cool experience, but I thought that there was probably something more kind of beyond that. I wasn't sure if the military was quite my path, and there was a guy from our unit that ended up getting out and joining a company called Blackwater in about October 2003 timeframe. He said to me, he's like, hey, you got the same resume as I do. I think you'll be able to get in with these guys. Why don't you drop your resume, see what happens? So here we are, December 2003 timeframe. Invasion of Iraq happened, I believe, in March of 2003. So here we are about 7-8 months later. The U.S. Secret Service came in and was supposed to protect the ambassador. And they did an assessment on the city of Baghdad where the ambassador was going to be. And they're like, this is kind of out of our realm of knowledge, expertise to provide a sustained protection solution for the ambassador. So it ended up getting outsourced to a private military corporation, and that corporation that won the contract was Blackwater. It all started with a phone call from one of their recruiting managers who said, are you interested in, protecting this U.S. ambassador? You'll end up going to a 2-week train-up / assessment of your skills to make sure, you could essentially shoot, move, and communicate. And you'll be making $500 a day. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, that sounds good. And $500 a day, I'm trying to do the math in my head, but I've never had to calculate, that number before because that's a wage that was kind of unheard of at that time. So I kind of paused for a minute. He's like, yep, it's $15,000 a month. And I said, $15,000 a month, I'm in. Let's do it. He said, okay, well, I'm going to process you here. We'll book some plane tickets, and you'll be coming out to our training site out in Moyock, North Carolina. And so flew out there. It was a very new experience. I think what was new about it was I didn't really know that this world existed when I was in the military. I didn't know the government, outsourced these types of operations, these types of contracts. I figured everything was, handled by the military. I guess a little bit, naive, just, ignorance. But it was a completely new world that I didn't know existed. And so, you were the corporate warrior is what it was kind of known as, back then. Quiet professional, the silent professional, the private military contractor. Some people use the term mercenary. However, mercenary isn't an accurate description, and that's mainly because we were supporting the U.S. government, we're supporting U.S. democracy, and we weren't pledging our allegiance to a foreign nation or being paid by a foreign nation. Arriving at the airport, our instructions were to meet down at the baggage claim, and the Blackwater guys will be down there, and you'll know who they were. Looking around, you could kind of tell who the people were probably a part of the organization and who weren't, just kind of by the way they were kind of built, their demeanor. They were all big dudes, in shape, bearded, in suits. I said, okay, grab your bags. There's, 2 black Suburbans outside, throw them in the Suburbans and we'll move out to the hotel. Nothing like basic training at all. A lot more professional, kind of, big boy rules. Not like, no, you have to be here, and if you're not, you're AWOL. No, they don't care. Like, if you're not there, that's it. You don't, get to make $500 a day. It was a compound out in the middle of nowhere, small farm town that had no idea that there was this huge, training facility out in the countryside that had shooting ranges just for little bird helicopters. It eventually evolved into all sorts of other stuff after that. On a day one is the initial in-dock where everything is a pass-fail. So if you fail, you go home, and that's it. I mean, I was a young kid at the time, 24 years old, but there was a lot of guys who were, retired out of DevGru. I would say 80% of the class were all SEALs because it was a company owned by SEALs, Eric Prince. Ended up going through the shooting quals. I passed PT test really well, and then moved on to the kind of training phase over the course of the next 2 weeks. And this was a training phase kind of designed to teach on a PSD and motorcade operations. At that time, it was kind of a newer concept, and the only people that really knew about these kind of operations were your private military organizations. So everybody was pretty professional. Everybody was an alpha male. If you were a good shooter, they kind of welcomed you in a little more. I mean, if you were a dirtbag in any way, well, they didn't welcome you. And not only that, you wouldn't move on to the next, phase. So it was kind of weird because, like, you would see a guy one day and then the next day he'd be gone. At the completion of the 2-week course, you pretty much deployed immediately thereafter. I think the hardest part of all that was, not knowing if today or tomorrow or when was going to be your last day. Actually, making it through to the end and being, selected. Because even though you make it through, you might not get selected to deploy. And at that time, contracts were few and far between, and there weren't really very many contractors out there. So at the time, the most, stressful part for me was, okay, well, I just took out a loan of money that I don't have to pay for gear that I didn't have because I'm going to make $500 a day. But in order to make that $500 a day, I've got to complete this training. I had a lot of things working against me, but I thought, well, you know what? There's a lot of guys here who have a lot of experience. If I go in there, concentrate on the hard skills that I have, excel there, and if I keep my mouth shut and be a sponge and just absorb as much as I can, then I might have a chance to make it through. We ended up deploying out of Norfolk International Airport, and at the time we were on a chartered aircraft with probably about 20 or so American expats, all Blackwater contractors, and then about 50 Chilean contractors that Blackwater had also outsourced and deployed to kind of man like a lot of the static, security sites. I arrived in Kuwait City on a chartered aircraft, and Kuwait at that time, hot during the day, 100, 120, somewhere in there, and it was hot. We all loaded up onto the C-130, took off, like normal, but then when we got into Baghdad, we ended up doing a combat landing. I thought, I'm going to die before I even get in the country. This is a nosedive combat landing, which I've only experienced with Blackwater pilots in a Blackwater aircraft, which was the Casa 212. Well, essentially, they fly over the airfield, they point that nose straight down, and they drop, and they drop, and they drop. And at the very last minute, they pull up, and boom, there you are on the runway. And I was like, holy shit. So at that point, we had to travel down was the most dangerous stretch of road in the entire world. It's called Route Irish. And there was a stretch of it that like around 14 or 15 people were killed every single day. So the chances of getting smoked, were pretty high, especially if you were in a soft skin, vehicle. It has no armor on it, no bulletproof windows. If you take rounds, they're going to go right through like a hot knife through butter, all day long. So, ended up getting to where I was going to be living at, which shortly after the invasion, the military rolled in, kicked Saddam Hussein's mother out of her house, and they put the ambassador in that house. So the ambassador was in this 3-story, all marble, beautiful palace, and that's where I lived. So, and then Ambassador Bremer, he worked in what we call the CPA, the Central Provisional Authority, which was at that time the U.S. Embassy. So contracts back then, you signed a 3-month contract, and then if you wanted to extend, you could extend. And if you wanted to go home for a month or two, you could go home, you could come back. It was really flexible, really convenient. It wasn't like a military deployment at all. All of us that came in were replacements for guys who went home on leave, who rotated home. But the thing is, most guys wanted to stay there because you're only making money when you have boots on ground. If you're at home on leave, you're not making that $15,000 a month. So first day on the job, I was on the static security side of the house. My responsibility was, the security of the compound where we had Ambassador Paul Bremer, which was, not a very big place, but the palace was a giant palace. So we controlled all access in and out of the compound, vehicle access, pedestrian access. But it was still open, to attack, which is why they paid us $15,000 a month. So there was one night, the sun had just gone down, and the detail lead kicks the door open, and he yells, "Get it on, we're under attack." And I said, oh shit, this just got real. So I threw up my poncho liner, and by the time the poncho liner floated down to the bed, I was completely clothed, completely kitted up, had my M4, and I was out the door. It was nothing but gunfire. 360 degrees, completely surrounded us. You could see the tracers. And so at that point, the first things that happen is, your palms get sweaty. Your mouth kind of goes dry. So I went upstairs, grabbed the ambassador, knocked on his door. I said, "Sir, we're under attack. Need to move you to the hard room." He grabbed his book, and he didn't really acknowledge me at all. So we put him in the hard room. I said, "Sir, I need you to, put your armor on." And the whole time he's reading his book because he knows his Blackwater guys are outside, securing his compound. So he's got nothing to worry about. He trusted us 100%. So I put his armor on. I said, "Okay, stay here. We're going to, go square this away outside." So I stepped outside. I started hearing tink, 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 tink. And I looked down, and it's bullets. All the tracers that were shooting up in the air, well, they have to come down somewhere, and they were all coming down around me. But if one of those bullets would have caught me with no helmet on, that's it. I'd be done. What a horrible way to go. We got intel that the Iraqi soccer team won, and all of that gunfire was celebratory gunfire. It gave the impression that, we were under fire. We had a U.S. ambassador who was in charge of the reinstitution of a new government and the reconstruction of Iraq. So what that meant was there were a lot of pissed off Muslims and a lot of pissed off terrorists. For the first time in world history, a Christian American in charge of a Muslim nation. And so there was a $15 million bounty on the ambassador's head. And in March, El Zarqawi put an extra 22 pounds of gold on this ambassador's head and called for every terrorist in the world to converge on Baghdad and kill this ambassador. And a small handful of us protecting him had a $50,000 bounty on our heads. So I ended up, working for Blackwater for another 3.5 years after that. So till about 2008 timeframe. And then in 2009, I ended up going to work for a company called the Four Horsemen. It was based out of Kabul. It was an American company owned by a former Green Beret And the mission was quite different than all the other missions in the past. Instead of doing PSD or static security, our job was to transport U.S. mail. So we were essentially the Pony Express of Afghanistan. And we had a 100-man Afghan militia force to assist us in transporting this U.S. mail, safely and securely. There's a few factors that affect the morale of troops overseas. So if mama's cookies, grandma's cookies, if, your girlfriend's car doesn't get into you with, her perfume sprayed in on the inside, that's going to drop morale. And when you're at a combat outpost out in the middle of Afghanistan, in the middle of nowhere, it takes 2 weeks to get the mail. If the Taliban could affect that, and now it takes a month for you to get all that good stuff, your morale is going to drop. And the Taliban knew it. So this was a super dangerous contract where you were guaranteed action. So I'm like, guaranteed action. That sounds right up my alley. What's the pay? And they're like, $6,000 a month. Wow. I was making $650 a day with Blackwater just a couple years, prior. And I said, well, you know what? I think this is a worthy cause, transporting U.S. mail. I think this matters. It's a cause worth jumping on, even if it was $6,000 a month. And it's actually good money if you're in the States. That breaks down to, $200 a day, which on an 8-hour day, it's $25 an hour. Well, $25 an hour, you could get, a construction job, and you're not going to be risking your life on a daily basis. On this specific contract, we got ambushed every single day by as many as 200 Taliban in one ambush. So, not good odds. It takes a certain kind of individual, to accept a contract like this. And I think it's kind of partially because, I believe in the cause. I believe in the fight. I believe in, supporting the troops. And so, this mission, directly, supports the troops. I mean, that meant the world. So I would link up with my militia outside of Kabul, 100 guys with RPGs, on a machine guns. You name it, they had it. My objective is to go pick up Connexes from Bagram Airfield. I transport it, to Kabul, and we would drive these to all the combat outposts. So everybody knew what was in that Connex. It was U.S. mail, and the Taliban knew that they needed to hit that. And you didn't have a whole lot of time to train your militia. And the Taliban at that point were pretty well trained, pretty well seasoned already. So it didn't take long for them to maneuver on you. And once they maneuvered on you, you were pretty much screwed unless you had other assets. So, we took a lot of wounded. We had a lot of KIAs on our side, a lot of Afghans. We get ambushed every day, all day long until we got to, the outpost to deliver the mail. And then we had to drive back. And it seemed like we'd get wounded every single day. So then, we're transporting U.S. mail out to one of these combat outposts. We're driving along, and the lead vehicle gets hit by an IED. And it was a small IED, but enough to blow out the windows, enough to cause, shrapnel damage, to the drivers inside. And at that point was when, the Taliban used that to initiate the ambush. And, RPG hit the lead vehicle. At that point, we just moved into this, little mud hut and started engaging bad guys. And at that point, it was total chaos. And I had tunnel vision. My mouth was dry. My hands were sweaty. Everything they say happened. But at that point, I've already been, through so many ambushes, and of course, training. All that kicks in. It all kind of takes over. And that point of when it became real was when one of my friends got hit. We were inside of a mud hut. This was a kalat. It had a sand floor. I remember the sun just kind of, baking on me, from outside because it had no roof on it. But I remember the walls being extremely tall, maybe 8 feet tall. So you couldn't really climb up on anything to engage from up there. It was the worst place you could be in and be ambushed. As American military forces, we're trained, to, not stay in one spot for too long. We're trained, to shoot and move to a new position. So that way, the bad guys, can't, track in on you and engage you and kill you. My friend was a South African, and he stayed in the same spot, and he ended up catching a round to the face because of it. Right through the chin, blowing off his jaw, and went through his neck. It was almost total loss of life for him. He laid back. He was just sitting up against the back wall, which was a few feet away. Now, because he was shot through the neck, every time my buddy's heart would beat, imagine a water fountain of blood was kind of shot in an arc across, almost hitting me. And I was about 10 feet away from him. And I thought, this is absolutely insane that blood was shot out of him and can reach me, 10 feet away. And so each time his heart would beat, a new arc of blood would shoot out, but it would become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. I didn't have much time left before the blood stopped squirting. We're trained to win the fight first. After the fight is won, you could take care of the wounded. 4 or 5 arcs later, there was a lull in the ambush. I ran over to him. I swept the teeth out of his mouth and saw the bleeding. I ended up dumping some Traumadex onto his neck, which you're never supposed to do in a neck wound, ever. But it was either that or he was going to die. So I did that, and then I wrapped him with a gauze bandage. And he wanted to get back in the fight. He couldn't speak, but he wanted to grab his rifle and continue, on. And I said, no, man, you're good. We got things under control. And then it was at that time that a Dishka opened up. Holy shit. A Dishka is basically the Russian version of our 50 caliber machine gun. That's it. We're screwed. And I said, that's going to rip through this Kalat, because it was super close. I mean, half a mile would be super close. So I look out the window and I realized it was one Humvee with 3 guys from the AMP, Afghan Military Police. And I thought, holy shit, I think we got saved here. I was totally shocked, but realized at that moment, this is our time to get our wounded and get out of the kill zone. And that's exactly what we did. And we ended up moving on down to an outpost not too far away. And we put our South African on a bird and got him to Bagram. Yeah, so, 99% of the time, Afghan military police were absolutely worthless. And this 1% of the time just miraculously totally saved our butts. I think there's a big misconception out there. People will think, oh, well, these contractors are out there and they're, always running and gunning and they're getting into battles and every day, all the time. That's actually not the case at all. Contractors are there to augment the military in, strictly, defensive operations. But there's been years where I've been over there in Iraq. We don't get engaged. We don't engage any bad guys from any kind of engagement. Like nothing happens. It's totally quiet. And we call those the good days. And then the day I was supposed to leave, I woke up that morning, had everything packed, and a helicopter was coming in for me like early in the morning. But the Taliban attacked us on the day I was supposed to go home. And so, again, another huge battle ensued. Everybody's running to the wall. I grab my weapon. I'm running. As I'm running, you could hear the machine gun fire just cranking. We ended up, kind of winning, the fight, there with a couple decisive on a mortar, rounds, that landed in some key spots. And then that night I got on a bird and I went home, and 3 days later I'm in America again, on the southern shores of Lake Michigan in July. That's kind of a strange feeling in itself right there. After that battle, like my hooch where I was living, it took a rocket and it burned to the ground. And I said, you know what? This should be a sign. I should never come back ever again. And I made a promise to myself I would never return to the wars. I was in search of starting a normal person life here in America. And that right there was the hardest thing to do, because I had absolutely no network here in America because I spent my entire adult life overseas. I am kind of failing miserably at trying to find a job here in America. So maybe 6 months later, I went to work for an electrical company out of Chicago. I was like an assistant project manager, and it was probably like the lowest point of my life. I remember times where I would drive my truck to work, on a 45-minute drive. I'd sit there in the job site, parking lot, and I would look at the job site that I was going to. I would think about, the places that I've been, look back at the job site, and I would cry, to myself in the morning in my truck, thinking, I don't want to go in there. I don't belong here. I don't even know what I'm doing here. I don't even want to be here. And so, that was an extremely low point for me. But I said, you know what? This is the promise I made to myself. I'm going to give it a year here at this job, just to see what, develops. Who knows what can develop? So a friend of mine in the Houston, Texas area, he was in the private security industry. He said, hey, man, you got the right skills. Why don't you come down here? I'll get you a job down here, and I'll relocate, and I'll be able to get you work. That was kind of the tipping point of where, life started to kind of turn around and, kind of go in a positive direction. After a couple of years in Houston, I got hooked up with a company that was doing hostage rescues. And I got hooked up with them because I actually did a hostage rescue for them in Central America. I completed the mission. I did it, so well. They said, how do we keep you full time? And I said, I would like a normal person job in America. And then I ended up becoming their director of operations. So instead of me actually, going on assignments all over the world, I put together teams of guys like myself, and I deploy them all over the world. And then right around that time, I met my wife, or who is now my wife, a former Army captain, and we started a business venture, designed to helping transitioning veterans. I wanted to help men and women not go through the same, pitfalls that I went through while trying to transition, and we called it Silent Professionals.
Man, sitting down with Adam, I could see on his face the different reactions while he was telling the stories, and it was genuine. So it was a really good forum for us talking back and forth.
Yeah, it's really cool after reading about Blackwater for so long and to actually hear a story from a person and sort of put that human face onto something that we hear about so much.
Yeah, and Adam's journey isn't done yet. We'll pick up with his and his wife's company, Silent Professionals, in our re-enlistment episode. This is where we'll focus on that transition from soldier to contractor.
And we'll talk about what it takes to make the cut and take a look inside the job market today.
And thanks to Adam for sharing his story. And thanks to Stars and Stripes for giving us this opportunity to bring people like Adam to you.
If you enjoy hearing firsthand accounts of contracting life, we'll be back every other episode with more personal experiences. And you won't want to miss our next episode. It delves into a topic we couldn't avoid talking about, Blackwater. It's the name everyone thinks about when talking about private security contracting.
So don't forget to subscribe and let us know your thoughts, or if you have any experiences or suggestions you would like to share. Our email is podcast@stripes.com.
This is Force for Hire.